What's going on, everybody? We're here today to have a self-paced version of the essay writing process. So if you're somebody who missed class or maybe fell behind, or you just want a refresher on whatever it is that we went over for literary analysis writing, you came to the right place. So this is going to be a walkthrough with me of a literary analysis, argument, persuasive writing lecture, essentially. And all of the activities that we've done in class, whether that's essentially with Nearpod, we're going to be doing them during this video as well. You can either follow along with this video, or you can, go through the slides yourself at your own pace without my walkthrough. All right, so literary analysis, argument, persuasive writing. What is the purpose of why we're writing this type of style? The purpose is to change the reader's point of view, to bring about some action on the reader's part, or to ask the reader to accept the writer's explanation or evaluation of a concept, issue, or problem. Alright, so here's kind of how an argument essay is going to work. We're going to be looking at 4 different parts. There's the introduction, where you're going to introduce the topic and state your purpose. We're going to talk a little bit about appeals, which is something that I didn't go over in class, but is not something that you have to kind of make a separate section for. It's more something that's going to be intertwined throughout your writing. And so appeals are used to persuade or convince your reader. After that, you're going to get into your body paragraphs, which is like the heart of the essay, which is what we've been really working on with your literary analysis organizers. This is where you're going to provide evidence to support your purpose or the essay prompt that you chose. And then lastly, there's going to be the conclusion, where you wrap it all up, draw a conclusion to emphasize the points that you just made from your body paragraph. Here's kind of the agenda that we're going to go through this. Don't mind that it's highlighted Monday at the top, but we're going to go through the introduction paragraph, then appeals, body paragraphs, and concluding paragraphs. For all 4 of these things, you're going to have an opportunity to at least practice and write a little bit, just to get you started. So here are the goals, hopefully by the end of this self-paced lesson. Number 1, with intros, practice writing and summarizing the text. Have an understanding of the necessary requirements of an introduction. Appeals. Understand what logos, pathos, and ethos is, which is the 3 types of appeals that we'll be going over. Body paragraphs. Get an in-depth understanding of the parts that make up a body paragraph, and see how to incorporate appeals into your analysis and topic sentences and just the paragraphs altogether. And lastly, concluding paragraph. Gain an understanding of how to construct a conclusion, how to not repeat yourself, essentially, and what not to do when you get to the end of your paper. Introduction paragraph. If you're following along on Nearpod, which you should be if you're watching this video, this is a good opportunity to click on that little notes icon over on the right, just like it shows in the image. If you click on the notes tab on the top right corner of your browser, or maybe on the app if you're using your phone, it gives you the option to save your notes to Google Drive. And the reason that this is a good idea is because it'll create a Google Doc with all the slides that we're going over right now, and it'll save it. And so any notes that you decide to take, or even any activities you participate in, especially like the open-ended questions, this is a good chance to, have that for reference later on. And I'll show you an example of what that's going to look like when you save a Google Doc version of your notes or use the note-taking feature on Nearpod. Like I just mentioned, it's going to save every one of the slides. This is just an example. This isn't the same one that we're looking at right now, but very similar. And so even if you participate in any polls, here are the slides. Here's kind of a test, right? If there's an open-ended question, it's going to save your response to the question, and also if you have notes on that slide. And this is what the notes are going to look like at the bottom of every slide that you type on. So highly suggest that you use the note-taking feature from Nearpod. It'll save a document just like this straight to your Google Drive, and you can always reference it later on, especially during this essay writing process. All right, so here's kind of a breakdown of what we're going to get into with the introduction paragraph. First, how do I get started? I think that's the most difficult part about an essay. Then, the 3 important questions that an intro answers. What are the requirements for it? And then go deeper into what those requirements are and wrap it up with a thesis statement. All right, so here's our first open-ended question. What I want you to do right now is take a moment. If you had to summarize the hate you give by Andy Thomas to a friend, or if you were posting on social media like captioning on Instagram, sharing with an audience who has never read the book or seen the movie, what would you say or write? So pause the video here if you're following along with the self-paced slides on your pod, so that way you have a moment to write your thoughts down. And we'll continue in a moment. Alright, now I have a second question for you. So based off of that previous question, the summary that you gave, what do you think the author's, Angie Thomas's, purpose for writing The Hate U Give is? And how can you connect that to the prompt that you chose? So if you forgot what the prompts are, or if you just don't remember fully what yours says, click on the little image on the right hand side over here. It's called the reference image. When you click on it, you're going to find the 3 essay prompts right here. Take a look at that really quick and answer the following question. What do you think the author's purpose is for writing The Hate U Give in relation to one of these prompts? And there's some examples down here if you want to read through them. So while you're thinking, I'll read them to you. Prompt number 1. Angie Thomas's The Hate U Give illustrates how systemic racism is perpetuated in Star's life by the police, her family, and her friends. Prompt number 2. In The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas, Star Carter experiences institutional, interpersonal, and internalized oppression from the police, her family, and friends. And lastly, number 3. Star Carter struggles to find her voice in The Hate U Give when she deliberates on speaking on the police brutality towards African Americans, towards her friends and family. Take a moment again to pause if you need to, write down your thoughts, and when you're ready, resume the video, and we'll move on to the next slide. Alright, so continuing on the introduction paragraph. 3 important questions that the introduction paragraph answers. Number 1, what is this? Number 2, what do you want me, the reader, to do? And number 3, why am I reading it? So for each of these questions, they answer one thing in particular that helps build the introduction paragraph out. The first one, you're providing some context with the setting, time, place, characters, location even. And then you're going to state the main ideas, key conflicts, any themes, or anything that might need defining that your reader might not know about. So that's what you would want your reader to do, to inform them. And then you're going to tell them, why are they reading this? This is where you're stating the purpose, or stating your thesis. And that thesis statement is going to lay out the direction in which your paper is going to take. Like I said earlier, the most difficult part of a paper is getting started. And what we just did in the past 2 open-ended questions is getting started, right? Just like the first question here, what is this? You just summarized the book. And then you stated what its purpose was. And of course, that's not going to be your final way that you're going to describe it in your paper, but it's just to get those ideas flowing, right? It's the whole point of going through this self-paced series together. So, how do we answer those questions? What are the requirements that make up those 3 big questions that an introduction answers? Here's a specific checklist. There's the author and title, background info, themes and key conflicts, and the thesis statement. As a reminder, if you would like to take notes, I highly suggest it so you can add on what are important things that you're seeing on these visuals right now. So, there's author and title. Make sure you capitalize the author's name and italicize the title. Now, if you're someone who gets confused on, well, how do I know whether to italicize or use quotation marks? Think of it this way. With larger text or larger, things in general, let's say books, movies, TV shows, those are often italicized, large works, right? And then from that kind of top-down model, from the top, large works, then smaller works. Those smaller works are typically in quotation marks. Titles of songs, poems, news articles. Those things are in quotations. So larger works, italicized, smaller ones in quotation marks. After that, you're going to get into some background info. So just like the first question is answering, right? Did you provide sufficient information as if your audience has never read this book? Just like the question that I asked you earlier. And whatever that information might be, whether that's setting, characters, especially ones that are present in your evidence. So if you're going to be referencing a character later in your body paragraph, make sure that you kind of introduce who they are and a little bit of why they're important in your introduction. So for example, if you're going to mention Star's parents in one of your pieces of evidence, well, you want to make sure you introduce who they are in the beginning. Same goes for any other characters like Uncle Carlos or Haley and Maya. It varies on the evidence that you choose for your body paragraph, but it'd be a good idea to introduce, places like Williamson or Garden Heights to give your reader some context, because you want to assume that they've never read this book before, even though I'm the one that's going to be reading your essay. All right, next, themes and key conflicts. So what are the themes, main ideas, key conflicts that need to be addressed before presenting your thesis? Now, just like the essay prompts, some of these things are already in there. Let's say with number 2. Clearly, you need to define what institutional, interpersonal, and internalized oppression might be. Your reader might not know what the 4 I's of oppression are. Same goes with number 1. What is systemic racism? You may need to inform them in your introduction. And then lastly, there's your thesis statement. This is going to be the last sentence of the introduction, stating the 3 topics your body paragraph will address. And so those 3 topics, let's just use prompt number 2 again. You're going to talk about institutional, interpersonal, and internalized oppression. Pretty clear, right? After your intro, there's going to be 3 paragraphs about each of those topics. All right, let's go more in depth into those things. How do we meet each requirement that we just talked about? So let's look back at these 3 questions. What is this? What do you want me, the reader, to do? And why am I reading it? In its simplest form, you're setting the context, stating why the main idea is important, and then writing your thesis. 1. Setting the context. Now, this is optional. You can include a hook, which many of you did last semester when you wrote your informative explanatory paper on police brutality. A hook, again, is a statement, question, fact, quote that catches your reader's attention, and it may even set the tone of the paper. So if you recall, maybe some of you wrote in your paper about BLM, and you wrote about George Floyd's death. That was very much a good hook, in the sense that you caught the reader's attention, gave them a picture of the power in the movement of BLM, especially in this past spring, and then you went on to talk about stop and frisk and racial profiling, etc. You can also summarize the book or the topic. Again, not to be repetitive, but setting, time, location, characters, etc. And make sure you introduce the author and the title at some point in the introduction, whether that's in this first part, in the thesis statement. Just make sure you properly capitalize the name of the author and italicize the title of the text. All right, number 2 and 3, state why the main idea is important. This is where you're going to tell the reader why they should care and keep reading. Are there, again, any themes, main ideas, terms, critical concepts that need to be explained? So make sure you give enough detail, because you're low-key teaching your reader, but not so much that it distracts them from the point, right? But you do need to explain, what are these terms? Again, they may not have read an article on systemic racism or the reading for 4 I's of oppression. So a tip is, where do I even start with finding these topics? Again, let's look back at the essay prompt that you chose. What are the keywords or themes that attracted you to choose prompt number 2? Why are they so important to you or the story? That might help you better form your introduction after you think about those questions. So in class, we took a moment to check for understanding using the Booth Kahoot. Time to climb. So we're going to play a quick game. What are the important requirements that the introduction answers for your reader? So before I move on to the next slide, or before you move on to the next slide, make sure you lower your volume in case the game music is too loud. I'm not sure how it looks in the self-paced version. Just take a moment, try to answer the questions, and then we'll move on to the thesis statement. All right, time to climb. Cool. So choose your character, I guess. You can skip ahead of this part. I don't really know what's gonna show. Oh, well, there's that music. There's a lot of characters in there. I guess I could still start it. All right, thesis statement. This is the last sentence of your introduction. This is your main idea or the main argument. Now, what is a thesis statement? This is the point that you want to prove through 3 topics, aka your body paragraphs, topic sentences. Again, this is the last sentence of the introduction that maps out the issues you're going to analyze for the essay. So here's a tip. Think back to the prompt you chose. What topics need to be addressed? And here's an example for each of the 3 prompts, right? So for number 1, perpetuating systemic racism. Some of those topics or key concepts, critical concepts, might be systemic racism, racial profiling, law enforcement, stop and frisk, whatever else you can think of. 4 I's of oppression. There's ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. And then for number 3, your voice matters. You might think about Star's identity, her friends, and her family. So what makes up a thesis statement exactly? A thesis statement is contestable, meaning it should be arguable, that there's another opinion or perspective that the audience can have, but you're showing them yours. It should be supportable. There should be evidence to support your side and the claims that you're making, which is what you're going to be doing in your body paragraph, right? It should be clear. It should clearly state the 3 topics you're going to address in your essay. Again, just like, let's go back really quick, just like with each of the prompts that are right down over here, right? They each kind of have 3 things about them. And I think number 2 is probably the clearest example immediately, just because you're choosing from the 4 I's. And so you can easily pick one of those 3. So again, it should be clear. Clearly state the 3 topics you're going to address in your essay. And lastly, it should be consistent. Everything in this essay connects back to this thesis statement. So your topic sentences, your analysis, everything ties back to the 3 topics that you mention in the thesis statement, which supports to prove this sentence. All right, so here's again some example thesis statements. So for prompt number 1, Angie Thomas's "They Hate You Give" illustrates how systemic racism is perpetuated in Star's life by the police, her family, and friends. Number 2, in "The Hate You Give" by Angie Thomas, Star Carter experiences institutional, interpersonal, and internalized oppression from the police, her family, and friends. And number 3, Star Carter struggles to find her voice in "The Hate You Give" when she deliberates on speaking on the police brutality towards African Americans, towards her friends, and family. And so these are kind of more simple examples of what a thesis statement could be. It can be a little more complicated, and it may not even just have to do with police, her family, and friends. But those are definitely some 3 big concepts that we are kind of seeing throughout these first 8 chapters, right? And so these are just examples of thesis statement that you could incorporate yourself if you want, or alter it for your own purposes of what your argument is going to be based off of the prompt that you chose. 3 types of appeal: logos, ethos, and pathos. These appeals were coined by Greek philosophers. They're methods of persuasion used by speakers and writers to convince their audience. So, what are the 3 types of appeals? Logos, using logic and reason to persuade. Pathos, using emotions or emotional responses to persuade. And then ethos, using credibility or reliable sources to persuade. Alright, so there's a video that should be showing up on your screen, which is a quick crash course, not even a couple minutes, it's just under 2 minutes. It's a video talking about logos, ethos, and pathos. Take the next 2 minutes to watch it. There's a question at the end, and resume this video afterwards, and we'll move on to the next slide. Oh, here we go. Well, this is what it looks like on the teacher end, but quick video over here. Well, play it for yourself and keep this paused. Then when you're ready, resume this and we'll move on to the next slide. I'm going to ask you to incorporate at least one appeal into your essay. Now, this isn't exactly in the instructions because it's not something that you're going to make a separate paragraph for. It's more something that you're going to intertwine into your analysis or your evidence. Kind of will influence the choices that you're going to make in the way that you're going to analyze and try to convince or persuade your reader. So again, hopefully that video gave you a good idea of how logos, pathos, and ethos are used in about almost everything that we do in our lives, whether it's advertisements, media, public speakers. How do we even ourselves use these 3 types of appeals when we're just talking to somebody? How do I incorporate an appeal then? Logos, ethos, and pathos, like I just mentioned, this is actually a very subtle and could be a passive process, and it's not as obvious at first. If we look at the top left over here, you can incorporate an appeal by writing a topic or concluding sentence. You can choose the quotes that you want to use in your essay based off of one of these appeals. All your examples show a character making emotional appeals if you were to choose pathos, or maybe one of the characters, let's say like Uncle Carlos, uses logic to try to persuade other people. Another way you can incorporate an appeal is explain in your analysis or commentary how this appeal is present. We've kind of reached the end of the introduction here. One thing that I want to remind you all of is that there's no one way to write an introduction. And so here's kind of a list. I'm not going to read through each of these, but these are some of the general things that make up an introduction paragraph. Like I mentioned before, if we look over at number 4, making a startling statement or a hook, that's not required. You don't have to have a hook in your introduction. It's completely optional. But a hook can set the tone for the paper, right? Some other things that you may need to include if we jump back to the requirements of an intro: the author and title, sufficient background information, what are some key conflicts, and your thesis statement. But there are other things that you can include in an introduction, especially in different forms of writing that aren't just necessarily a literary analysis essay. But for today's purposes, we are just talking about argument writing. All right, so let's jump ahead to body paragraphs. If you need to pause here, go ahead, and maybe we'll continue this in a next video. So great job. Hopefully you learned a little bit about what an introduction paragraph is, the various moving parts that go with it, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for tuning in.